Hello, welcome to this first video where I turn an old oak countertop into an industrial coffee table. I started up this project by cutting up the countertop in individual beams using my track saw, and then I'm taking it over to the jointer. The first step is to make sure that my fence is square with the table, as you can see me here checking here with my square. And after that, I set up my safety fence such that I can safely process the wooden beams. And the first step in this process of processing the lumber is to flatten one of the faces, as you can see me do here. This machine slowly takes off the high spots of the material until we gradually take off material from the entire face, leaving us with a flat surface. And after this step is done, we move on to one of the sides of the beams, and we use the face that we just flattened as a reference against our guard, and we are slowly taking off material again of each pass until we are once left with a flat side, which is now perpendicular to the face that we planed in the previous step. And as you can see here, I am setting up the machine. Since this is a jointer and planer combination, I do some setup work where I flip up the tables and switch up the dust extraction so that we can now move on to the planing operation. And with the planing operation, it's quite similar, except for the fact that we don't take off material such that we are left with a flat surface, but rather we use the reference face that we just planed as a reference, and we make the other side perpendicular to that. And we always start off with the opposite side first. So as you can see here, I'm spinning the lever to set the height of the table, and I'm setting it a little bit higher than the width of the board. And as you can hear, the first pass only takes off a fraction of the material, but as we keep lowering the table, we start to take off more and more material until this side is also flat, and we've taken off material everywhere, and it is perpendicular to the opposite side. So now we are left with a total of 3 processed surfaces, 1 face and 2 sides. And now I lower the table and we move on to the final side, which is the opposite face. And you can see here slowly that with each pass we remove more of the painted surface and the wood grain is exposed, something which I always find very satisfying. We now have a fully processed board with 4 square and flat sides. However, these boards are still way too thick for the intended countertop which I have. So the next step is to take them over to the table saw and rip the boards to their respective width. For the ripping operation, I use a special blade which has fewer teeth, and there are some hollow teeth in between, which is why it's called a hollow teeth saw blade. For me, ripping is always a bit of a dangerous operation, so I'm moving very carefully here, only taking very shallow passes and also using a saw guide to guide the board as it moves through the saw blade. After all the boards have been ripped to width, I lay them flat on my workbench and I decide the order in which I want to glue up the panel. So I'm marking all the boards here, and I'm also drawing a big triangle on them so that I can always find the orientation which I want to glue them up in. The next step is take them over back to the table saw, and I cut them roughly to length. At this stage of the process I always keep a little bit of extra length, so that after the glue up I can trim the whole tabletop at once. And I put the boards back on the table. And as you can see here, I'm drawing some reference lines with my squares because I will be adding some dowels to connect the boards. Not only does this provide extra support when gluing the countertop together, but it also makes the glue up a little bit easier because it doesn't warp the boards as much, because the dowels prevent that from happening. Since I don't have a biscuit joiner or a domino, I use a doweling jig, as you can see here. And the way it works is it has two plates which you can attach with two knobs, and these are based on the thickness of the board. So as you can see, you set the correct width of your board, and then you set the depth on the drill collar such that it drills roughly half the length of the dowel, as you can see here. And there's a little marking arrow in the center of the drill bit, so you position it over the line I have just drawn, and I simply clamp it down and insert the drill with the collet into my drill, and you simply drill a hole which will be perfectly in the center of the board. And as you can see, the hole is perfectly in the center of the board, and we simply repeat the steps for all the boards and all the individual dowel locations. And after drilling all the dowel holes, it was time to start the glue up. And I got some help from my dad here, as you can see. And I first started off with putting some glue in each of the dowel holes and putting the dowels in place. After that we also started adding glue to the seams where the boards will be joined together, and we slowly slid all the boards into place. Since it was a little bit tricky to get the boards all together, I used some pipe clamps to clamp everything together, and I also made a little jig to raise them off the table surface. And we are slowly attaching the pipe clamps, and we are adding pressure in multiple steps so that we slowly push the boards together without causing them to warp. And after all the clamps have been thoroughly set and they're clamping the board, I also use some thick material, in this case some leftover table legs, to clamp both the top and the bottom of the surface area to prevent warping during the curing of the wood glue. And after gluing everything up, I let the glue dry overnight, and I came back the following day with my girlfriend, and we started by removing all of the clamps and setting everything back in their respective place. At this point the tabletop is still a bit too wide, so the first step is to cut it to the final width using my track saw, which you can see us do in the next clip. And since my girlfriend was around, I gave her the most fun job in the workshop, which was sanding the workpiece. For sanding, I use these little sanding nets. I really enjoy them because I have multiple sanders and each of them have a different suction hole pattern, and with these nets we reduce that issue since the net are just universal, for each sanding machine, and we can use them regardless. I made a little mistake by cutting the threaded inserts on the back of the tabletop, so I had to glue in a little dowel, and here you can see me do some more patch-up work by inserting a little piece of wood. So I started off with a chisel, making sure that I have a little piece of oak with the same matching grain pattern, which I put into place and clamped down with some glue. And the following day, when the glue dried, I trimmed off the excess using this little Japanese saw, which is perfect for the job since it has a very flexible blade. And I touched up the tabletop with the sander. I started off the sanding process with 80 grit, then I moved up to 150 grit and finished off with 240 grit. And after sanding everything to 240 grit, I take a little sponge with some water and I wet the entire surface of the countertop. This raises the grains, after which I sand it again with 240 grit, and this makes sure that the surface is silky smooth even after we apply the finish. So I just apply a little bit of water and wait for it to dry naturally, after which I sand the entire tabletop again. After giving it a quick dry off, we can start the finishing process, and for this job I chose to go with a Osmo finish. This is really my preferred finish because it doesn't stain the wood, doesn't leave like this yellowish stain, and next to that it is really easy to apply. So you can see me here cut up a little rag, and I quickly mix can and I open it and just thoroughly apply the first coat of oil. So as you can see here, I graciously apply the first coat and I wait for it to dry, roughly 5 to 10 minutes, and then I simply come back with a clean cloth and I dry off the excess. I believe this finish is comprised of two components, both an oil and a wax. So the preferred method is to apply two coats. The first one will be the oil settling in the grain of the wood, and the second coat will give it a little bit of a finish because the wax will stay on the surface. However, for this project I chose to use some beeswax. As you can see here, I got some from my class and I'm just applying it with a little cloth. And the benefit of this is also that dust and other particles do not really stick in the wax. So next up, I started making the base of the countertop, and I started with each of the miter joints. And for this, I used a big angle grinder, kind of a wheel, which was actually terrible to set up, and the cuts were not nearly as accurate as I would have hoped. And in addition to that, because this is not really a saw, but rather more like a big grinding stone, it also left a lot of burrs, which I had to remove later. So after cutting all the pieces to length, I clamped them down and I took out my angle grinder and started removing all the burrs and cleaning up all the edges for welding. Some burrs were really thorough, so I had to get creative. I took out some pliers and some files and I cleaned up all of the edges. And after cleaning up all of the edges, it was time to align all the parts of the frame. However, because the miter joints were not really that accurate, I had to get a little bit creative with clamping everything up and getting everything square. So here I was just making sure that everything was square before clamping all the pieces down. But as you can see in a second, I will take out the GoPro, you can see that the miters are not really straight and there are quite some big gaps, which was a little bit unfortunate. However, I managed to get them square. I actually never welded before, so I'm probably doing a really lousy job here. I also didn't manage to capture a lot of the footage. This material was 1.5 millimeters thick, and I started off with a 0.8 millimeter gauge wire, which in hindsight was a little bit too thick. At the end of the process, I switched to a 0.6 millimeter diameter wire, which gave a much better welding seam in my opinion. After everything was glued together, I asked my dad to come help me with the surface finishing, since he's really a big fan of that. And I can already imagine the comments saying, why doesn't he wear some respirators like I am here? Well, I asked him many times to wear some personal protection equipment, but he insisted that his lungs were already shut anyway, so it didn't matter anymore. And after finishing the base, I came back to paint some more of the strips. As you can see here, I'm using some ammonia to prepare the surface, and then I'm painting all the surfaces black. And after that was done, it was time to assemble the base. I found this mesh wire at a local hardware store, and it was actually the perfect size for the base of my table. However, it was really expensive, but I figured it was worth the price. However, my first initial idea was to weld it onto the base. However, when we got back in the workshop and we actually tried to see if it was magnetic, which it clearly was not, so we actually bought a piece of aluminum. So we had to get creative with how we would attach this mesh wire onto the base. And our solution was to use rivets. So as you can see here, we took some angled pieces, which I also painted black, and we got everything in place. And as you can see here, I was rather struggling with the drill. I got my drill bit stuck, and I had to switch over to a bigger drill. After that, I started riveting all the pieces into place, which was actually also a rather big struggle. And especially on the sides where I intended to use smaller rivets, they were not nearly long enough to hold the mesh firmly in place. So I actually had to switch up the rivets 3 times and move to a bigger size in order to get everything together. By this point, I also attached the threaded inserts on the back of the tabletop, and I also added some little brackets, as you can see here on the sides of the top of the base. So right here I'm positioning the tabletop, which I'm obviously positioning the wrong orientation. So after getting it the right orientation, I took some nuts and washers and I attached them to the threaded inserts. And the reason I chose to go for threaded inserts is because this is a hardwood. Over time, the tabletop will expand and contract due to changes and fluctuations in humidity and temperature. And by using a washer and a nut into the threaded insert, sorry, not a nut, a bolt, and only tighten it ever so slightly, it gives the tabletop some wiggle room so it can expand and contract, and it will not rip or break over time, which is what we want ultimately. And as a finishing touch, you can see me attaching some feet here, which perfectly fit in the square profile. And with that, the process was done, the tabletop was ready, and I wrapped it up and got it back home for the final test, which was unwrapping it together with my girlfriend and moving it into our living room. So here I got it safely home with some bubble wrap, and I'm slowly unpacking it and putting it in its final position. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and maybe you have learned something from it. I will continue to capture my projects and post them here on this YouTube channel. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you would like to see any more of this type of content, I would really appreciate it if you would click the like button. Thank you very much, and maybe see you in some other time. Bye!